Good morning. This lecture video is going to go over the parts that make up the nervous system tissue, so specifically looking at supporting cells and neurons. There are two types of cells that make up the nervous system or nervous system tissue. There's supporting cells or neuroglia, and their job is to insulate, support, and protect the second cell, which is called the neuron. Neurons are very delicate, and these are going to be the cells that are actually going to transmit those electrical impulses from sensory organs to the central nervous system, and then from the central nervous system to muscles and glands. So depending on if we're in the central nervous system or depending on if we're in the peripheral nervous system, there are different kinds of supporting cells, but neurons can be found then all throughout to conduct those electrical impulses. Some examples of neuroglia or supporting cells found in the central nervous system include epithelial cells. These are going to be found in the cavities of the brain and the spinal cord. They have actually cilia on them that keep cerebrospinal fluid circulating throughout the central nervous system. You have astrocytes, which are really numerous star-shaped cells, and their job is to anchor neurons to capillaries and regulate exchanges between them. You have oligodendrocytes, which wrap around the nerve fibers to form insulating coverings called the myelin sheath. You can see that up there. And then you have microglia, which are going to be phagocytes that dispose of debris, including dead brain cells and bacteria. Those are the neuroglia that are in the central nervous system. The neuroglia in the peripheral nervous system include satellite cells and Schwann cells. Satellite cells are going to form a protective cushioning in the peripheral nervous system, and then the Schwann cells is going to form the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. So those are different types of neuroglia that exist. Looking at the neuron then, the neuron is going to be the electrical conducting cell of the nervous system. So this is the basic shape of a neuron. This big section right here is called the cell body. This is going to be like the metabolic center of the cell, and it contains the nucleus, which is found in green. These projections that are coming off of the cell body are called the dendrites. So their job is to receive and then convey messages to the cell body. So they're going to receive electrical and chemical signals from other neurons or from sensory organs, and they're going to then pass that information to the cell body, where the cell body will then pass that electrical signal down this long tail structure, which is called the axon, to the very end, which is the axon terminals. The axon is a fiber that conducts impulses away from the cell body, taking it to the axon terminals, and the axon terminals then are the branching fibers at the end of the axon. They contain tiny little pockets of chemicals called neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters are going to form chemical bridges from the axon terminals of one axon to the dendrites then of the next neuron in the chain. Now you notice here there is this yellow substance right here. This is the myelin sheath. So if we look right here, this myelin sheath then again is made by Schwann cells, and it is an insulating covering around the axon, and it helps make the axon or the neuron a little bit more efficient in how it transports its electrical signal. And you can see here the direction of the impulse. So the impulse is going to always go from cell body, from dendrites to cell body to the axon terminals. These nodes of Ranvier are located in between, little gaps in between this myelin sheath, and it's going to allow the impulse to kind of jump from one node to another node as it makes its way down the axon. The myelin sheath is really important because these are going to provide extra insulation. Not every single neuron has a myelin sheath on it, but some of these neurons do. It's a white fatty material called myelin that covers it, and again its job is to insulate those fibers and make the transmission more efficient, so it increases the speed that neuron or that impulse can travel down the axon. Kind of looking back at these Schwann cells then, just because they are an important part, they are going to be found along the axon, and they're going to make that myelin sheath. So, and you can see then how those Schwann cells just kind of wrap around, producing this myelin that protects and insulates that axon. At the very end of the neuron is the axon terminal. Like I mentioned, at the axon terminal, the axon is going to branch into hundreds or thousands of these axon terminals, and each is going to contain vesicles or sacs, little pockets of chemicals that are called neurotransmitters. So here's an axon terminal right here, and you can see these little pouches that contain chemicals called the neurotransmitters. Those are going to be the little blue dots in there. So when a nerve impulse reaches, you can see the arrow, the nerve impulse reaches the end of the axon terminal, it is then going to cause these vesicles to release the chemical in between the gaps. So this is the dendrite here of the next neuron. It's going to cause these chemicals to release into this area. They're going to bind to the dendrite of the next neuron and form a chemical bridge that will allow the electrical impulse to continue to the next neuron. And we'll talk about how that works in the form of an action potential in one of the next lecture videos. So if you're looking again down at the synapse, here is the dendrite of one, the axon terminal. You can see that neurons don't actually physically touch each other. So the synapse is the gap between the two neurons. So the axon terminal of one, the presynaptic neuron, and the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron. And the reason the signal can continue from one to another is because of these chemical interactions that occur when these neurotransmitters are released from one and bind to the surface of the next neuron, allowing a chemical bridge to exist and passing the axon, or passing the impulse, to the next neuron. Last couple things you can kind of see in nervous tissue where myelinated neurons are and where unmyelinated neurons are. So myelinated neuron is called white matter, so there are going to be big groups of neurons that have that myelin sheath. And then the gray matter, which is the darker stuff, that's going to be unmyelinated cell bodies. And in peripheral nervous systems, we call these bundles of nerve fibers nerves. Classification of neurons, there are three categories of neurons. There are sensory neurons, so these are going to carry impulses from receptors such as the skin or the eye to the central nervous system. So again, bringing information to the central nervous system from your sense organs. Interneurons are going to connect sensory and motor neurons together, and motor neurons are going to carry impulses away from the central nervous system to muscles or glands. And on this diagram you can see here's the spinal cord. This green is the sensory receptor. This purple is the motor neuron, and then interneurons, yellow, would be the things that are in between them, right in here. So we'll talk about how this works when we discuss specifically looking at spinal cord anatomy in one of the next videos. Last thing is looking at neuron structure. There are 4 types of neuron structure based on the number of processes that are extending from the cell body. So you can be a unipolar neuron. That's going to be with only one process coming off of the cell body. Bipolar is going to have 2 branches that come off. Multipolar are going to have more than 2, and these are the most common types of neurons found in the body. And then pseudo-unipolar, which is a type of neuron that has one extension from its cell body, but actually the axon splits into 2 branches. So one branch will go to the peripheral nervous system and one will go to the central nervous system. So that's kind of everything that you need to know about neurons. One last thing is some unique properties that neurons have. 2 major properties that are really important in its function is the idea of irritability, which is the ability to respond to a stimulus and then convert it to a nerve impulse, and then conductivity, which is the ability to transmit the impulse to other neurons, muscles, or glands.